itself.
Biggest
Really?
thing-
Is there?
Yeah. There is. Biggest thing is...
That picture was on the internet?
Yep. So it's on the internet. I sure forget what news story it came from. Maybe your local newspaper had an article on you, and that was a picture there.
I think it may have been in connection with the World War II memorial.
That could be. Could be.
Probably at dedication, they did a big, big deal out of it.
Well, it's rightfully so.
Well-
Well, tell me about this. The only reason we have you here is we want to put on record what you think about Raleigh Kidder.
Well, that you would not want to put on record. Well, Raleigh Kidder and I worked for close to 9 years together, 8.5 years, with another group of people. The four of us really worked wonderfully together on the World War II memorial. And we bonded together and we formed what I think is a lifelong friendship among the four of us, Ambassador Williams, Hayden Williams, and a woman general, Pat Foote, and I stress a woman general, Raleigh Kidder and myself. So the four of us worked very, very diligently and very proudly.
Well, we welcome you to Jamestown because for that reason we've been very proud of all that Raleigh's accomplished, and he said, I hope the day will come when he'll be able to invite Helen Fagin to join us, and the day has arrived.
Here I am.
Yep. Well, thank you. We showed you a movie here a few minutes ago, which were clips from the International Military Tribunal, which Jackson conducted, some clips from the History Channel on the Warsaw Ghetto. As you looked at that, what was your reaction?
Well, it's a twofold reaction. One reaction is, of course, a personal reaction, because I've been there. And another reaction is, why did the world allow that to happen? My personal reaction to the film was that I indeed was one of the people who had to wear the white band with the Jewish star, knowing full well that if I didn't, I could be not only punished, but even shot to death. Certainly, if I appeared outside the ghetto and be found out as a Jewish person being outside the ghetto, I would have been shot. The Warsaw Ghetto, as you saw in the film, was a horrific place, not only for healthy people, but especially for children. Children found themselves dying, and the tragedy of it all was that the public just had to accept it. There was no other way of dealing with it except self-preservation and survival. And survival was really the name of the game. I remember a statement by Elie Wiesel when he was asked that question after he had survived Auschwitz. He says, our only consideration was to be able to live yet another day. And our entire existence was reduced to the body, to sustaining our bodies. You saw the people, the emaciated people. You saw those prisoners of war, how emaciated they looked. So sustaining your life, such as it was the prerogative of the day. And surviving yet another day and not be caught for whatever the Germans consider a crime of living was the entire preoccupation of the day. However, there was also a spirit in the ghetto. The life and the persecution such as it was, the lack of food, the hunger. I mean, people really don't understand how a cultured, educated, wonderful human being could be driven by hunger. I remember looking at garbage cans for potato peels. And I remember afterwards I wrote something, sort of my wish, and one of my wishes was of eating a potato, a real potato, not potato peels, which we actually put in a kettle of water with some salt and called it soup. Somebody said, actually it was Viktor Frankl who said, in an abnormal situation, abnormal behavior seems to be normal. And our behavior from normalcy turned into being totally alien to the previous us, to the previous individual. If we separated ourselves sort of from the previous life in an out-of-body experience, looking from that angle onto ourselves, we wouldn't recognize ourselves. We couldn't perceive having to do the things that we did on one hand. On the other hand, there was a certain kind of a spirituality to our lives. Many of us looked for a way to give outlet to a different dimension of the human being, and that is the intellectual and mental dimension of a human being. We call it spiritual resistance. We divide resistance, especially in the ghettos, we divided it into physical resistance when it was at all possible, and the Warsaw Ghetto is the best example of it. Because in the physical resistance in the Warsaw Ghetto, youth, young men and women such as myself showed that we could hold the well-trained, well-armed German military to a 6-week resistance by just holding them off for 6 weeks, which was much longer than it took the entire well-equipped German army to occupy the country of France. So that was spiritual resistance because we knew full well that we are going to lose. There was no way that we could emerge victorious. Another resistance was the spiritual resistance. I myself, for example, conducted a school, a clandestine school, which I'll share at noon with teachers who will be here. We try to give some kind of a hope, provide some kind of a dimension of other life away from reality, a dimension to young minds to say, well, why don't we prepare them for the eventuality that they may live? Because life and death were the only choices that were left for us. There was absolutely no other way of looking at life. There was no way of saying, tomorrow I'll have lunch with somebody, or tomorrow I have to get up in the morning, go to school, or I have to do my homework if I were a young person, or whatever. Certainly there was no other diversion than worrying about whether or not we will live another day. So life in the ghetto was simply that kind of a consideration.
Give me a timeline here. Where were you born?
I was born in a place called Radomsko in Poland, which is a town just between equidistance from Warsaw and Krakow. our life was shattered with the very, very beginning of the time that Germany declared war to Poland, which was September 1, 1939. It was a Friday morning, 6 a.m., and the bombs began to fall on our town. And that was the beginning of my...
What was your reaction? Did you know it was coming? Did your family know it was coming?
No, you mentioned in the film about the meeting between Germany and Russia where they decided to launch that assault on Poland, and that was, I believe, in August of 1939. And that was a meeting between Ribbentrop and Molotov. And I remember we read in the papers about a meeting between Ribbentrop and Molotov. And Poland, you must know, Poland was a new republic. Poland was a republic which was reborn. Poland is a very old country. The history of Poland reaches back to 966 AD, when Christianity entered into the country, I mean the land of Poland, and a new dynasty of Polish kings who assumed Christianity began their reign in Poland and created a very viable country, a Christian country, a very Catholic country, witnessed by the present, now demised Pope. Poland suffered many partitions, and these partitions were usually between Prussia, present-day Germany, and the Hungarian-Austrian Empire and Russia. And there were a number of such divisions. The one especially was in 1832. May 1st is a national holiday, which ended this kind of a division. So after World War I, in 1918, the new Republic of Poland emerged after the Versailles Treaty and all that happened after World War I. So in 1939, the Republic was merely 21 years old. It was a very new country, but a well-established country. So I think that the atmosphere or the climate in which this Ribbentrop-Molotov meeting was accepted was that it's another political maneuver, but we will overcome it. But what they did was they mobilized their whatever army there was, and there was a mobilization. But certainly, everybody was surprised on the morning, Friday morning of September 1, with the planes overhead and with the bombs falling. As a result of it, our own home was bombed on the next day, which was September 2nd, on a Saturday afternoon at 2 o'clock. Our home was reduced to rubble.
Where did you go?
Well, we escaped the Friday morning, and we went east, thinking that we may outrun the Germans. Well, they caught up with us. And when we came back to our hometown, we found everything in rubble. And of course, soon after, the Germans instituted their favorite way of isolating the Jews, and that is created a ghetto.
So at some point, you're leaving your home, and they announce to you that you're going to be displaced. How did they tell you that you were going somewhere?
Well, Germans had a way of doing proclamation. And the word Achtung, attention, always preceded it. And everything was spelled out as a law by Hitler, law by the Führer. And this was it. And if you did not follow the proclamations, you broke the law. Ipso facto, you became a criminal because you broke the law. And that, of course, brought repercussions. And repercussions depended upon the mood and the humor of the person who was responsible for implementing the law.
The movement to Warsaw involved more than just Jewish people. Was it also the gypsies? Were there other groups?
There weren't many gypsies in Poland.
Okay.
Gypsies were mostly in Hungary and Romania and maybe in Czechoslovakia. There weren't many gypsies in Poland. The ghetto specifically was for Jews. There were no gypsies in the ghetto. Ghetto was specifically in the Jews. By the way, do you know where the ghetto originated? It originated in Italy. In the Middle Ages, one of the popes decided to isolate the Jews and send them to a place under a bridge in a foundry. The Italian word for a foundry is ghetto. And this name was coined for the future to just signify a place where people would be isolated, and especially for the Jews.
Mm-hmm. When they moved you to the Warsaw Ghetto, and this was your entire family at this
No. I got into the Warsaw Ghetto after 2.5 years in my Radomsko Ghetto, after it was liquidated.
Okay. Did they have houses for you, specific locations, or was it just kind of catch as catch can?
Well, what they did is they began to separate the local residents from Jewish residents, and they would empty certain districts of town of Jews and allowed the local non-Jewish Polish residents to occupy their homes. When Jews were told to leave their homes, they were not allowed to take much with them. And then a small district was designated as the ghetto. They called it das Jüdische Bezirk, which is a Jewish district. And they would designate apartments in that district. They would give one apartment, which may have consisted of 3 rooms and a kitchen, to 3 families to share that kitchen. One of the indignities that we suffered was that my parents and my 2 sisters, the 5 of us, occupied 1 room. And we had to share that apartment with 2 other such families. And the women who lived in comfort prior to that had to share that kitchen. It was a shock, not to mention the discomfort, not to mention the humiliation, not to mention the discomfort and the pain of everyday living. There were no shops to go to buy food. The food was rationed. You got a ration card, and you had to make do with whatever food you got. And sometimes you would not receive the food for a long, long period of time. So you had to scavenge.
And that's part of the Milkweed book, the character there.
Well, yes. He had to go outside the ghetto, through the hole in the ghetto, try to find, and that's why the children usually, and most of them, were used in order to procure the food, because the holes were very small in the ghetto. They were man-made, obviously, and the kids had to find their way through the hole, sometimes jump over the wall and procure some food. And many a times, and there are photos of such incident, where the guards would find some food on the kids and they would let them empty it, and the kids would return to the ghetto empty-handed.
I'm going to admit my naivete right now. The ghetto, was that originally set up as sort of a holding area, or was in fact that just one step in a process which would lead to the deportation, which would lead to that concentration camp?
Well, obviously it was both.
Yeah.
Obviously it was both. First of all, they have to establish demographically who belongs in the ghetto.
Mm-hmm.
And since they gave you cards to fill out in order for you to receive food, they were very capable of isolating those people whom they recognize as Jewish from the people whom they recognize as non-Jews.
Mm-hmm.
And it was step by step by step.
Was there a time where in the ghetto itself there was a sense that the deportation was going to start, and this was the next stage?
Towards the very end of the ghetto, yes. Yeah. Towards the very end of the ghetto, when they were doing so-called selections, and we called it actions, and we knew that people disappeared and never returned under the guise of taking them to work. They took detailed to work, and people just went and never returned. And of course the rumor started that there are places from which people don't return. Mm-hmm. And then there were some escapees from the transports who said that they were going to some very unusual places. And we soon found out that there was a place like Treblinka in our sector of Poland. Treblinka was the designated place. Mm-hmm. Auschwitz was the designated place for the southern Poland, also from other designations in Europe, like the Dutch. For example, Jews from Holland went to Auschwitz, Jews from Hungary went to Auschwitz, and also many Polish Jews finally went to Auschwitz. But Treblinka was the designation of Jews from Warsaw and its environs, and where I lived, most of the people went to Treblinka.
When you went to Treblinka...
I didn't go to Treblinka.
Okay. From where did you go?
I would rather not delve into my personal experience. I would like to deal with the overall Holocaust experience because it just makes me very uncomfortable.
You saw the movie where the Holocaust experience of that one general, United States general, and then where he talked about what occurred at Mauthausen, I believe, where his experience was. Did you get a sense that his comments were ones which you've learned through your involvement with in the studies? It was kind of an accurate reflection of what was going on generally at these concentrations?
Yes, except when it came to Jews, the designation was death and extermination. Mm-hmm. When it came to the POWs, especially American POWs, they were tortured, there is no question about it. But the designation, the final designation was not death and murder and killing. I mean, some were probably killed for disobedience, for insubordination, but the final solution, which was planned in January of 1942 at a villa in Wannsee, which is called the Wannsee Conference, was that concept of the final solution of the Jewish problem. In German, they called it the Endlösung der Judenfrage. And there were 15 people who met at that villa. And Himmler and Heydrich and Eichmann among them decided that this was going to solve the problem. And it was then decided that the eventual goal to the solving of the Jewish problem was to build death factories, death camps. And they were really contemplating the methods because they found out that asphyxiation didn't work. It wasn't fast enough. Individual shooting, which they had tried in the back of the head, it was too slow. It wouldn't exterminate them by the thousands. So one bright, well-educated chemist, German chemist, proposed a gallon of cyanide to be very effective in killing as many as 1,000 to 2,000 people at one shot. I gave a book to Raleigh about the justice and the judgment, and it begins with Robert Jackson's quotation. And one of the articles there deals with the concept of the genocide, how it was possible for them to be so effective in killing in such a short time of millions, I mean millions of people. So the treatment of POWs, even of the Soviet POWs, which was very, very harsh, they treated the Soviet POWs much, much harsher than the American POWs because they subjected them to experiments which they didn't dare to do with the American POWs. But as far as the Jewish inmates are concerned, they were destined to die. That was the ultimate goal. They used them for labor, they emaciated them, they starved them, and they used them eventually for byproducts, such as making, as horrible as it sounds, blankets out of the hair for the troops on the Eastern Front, making lampshades out of the skins, making soap out of the little fat that may have remained. So even their bodies were later used for byproducts. So the treatment of Jews and Jewish inmates was so extraordinary, and it really didn't apply for other nationalities. You know, only recently in an interview, Elie Wiesel had said that we should correct the statement that the Holocaust was a demonstration of inhumanity of men to men. He says, no, the Germans showed inhumanity, their inhumanity, mostly to Jews, not to all men.
Germans were not abnormal people in the sense that they kind of grew up in an environment which was not necessarily as a whole, and yet I think one of the lessons you do is how, quote, normal people could do such inhumane things to people.
There is a book about ordinary men doing all these things. And Raleigh and I discussed it yesterday. We're talking about that. And this is the warning sign. For those of us who are teachers, this is the warning sign that education per se does not educate a good person. That we have to concentrate on educating the character of a person. And I mean not only a character of a person who could later change and bend according to a political or ideological or a religious influence. And we are experiencing it right now, globally. If not in the United States, certainly all over the world. What we must impose upon our society is the necessity and indeed the absolute imperative of making sure that none of the present generation of young men and women will later on become a perpetrator. That when there is a choice of making a decision, that choice has to be made towards human treatment of another human person. because no matter what kind of a choice one makes, one cannot blame it on the devil. One cannot blame it on an influence from the outside. Not making a choice, as for the bystanders, for example, is also making a choice. As somebody said, the sin of omission is equal to the sin of commission. So you are absolutely right. Germany has proven that a cultural country, a civilized country, I mean a Germany that gave us a Beethoven, a Bach, a Brahms, a Schiller, a Lessing, a Goethe, the philosophers, gave us, even though he was a Jew, he gave us an Einstein. Even though he was a Jew, gave us a Freud, gave us people who invented wonderful strides in medicine, many of them Jewish too. This kind of a Germany was also capable to surrender all their achievements to this barbaric activity of that one episode, which we call the Holocaust.
You're riveting. What does this mean? I've got to ask the question selfishly. You're in a room here and you look around and you see 20-some photos of the Nuremberg trial, a trial which documented much of what occurred in Nazi Germany. You've been an educator on the Holocaust for many, many years. In your world, what does the Nuremberg trial mean?
Well, when Raleigh had asked me to come here and to speak, I thought to myself, the venue couldn't be any more propitious for me to talk about my mission. And I'm going to talk about it tonight. So I don't want you to steal my thunder. And I'm going to address it tonight because I gave some thought to it. This is a wonderful venue for discussing justice, for discussing dehumanization and what it leads to, and for discussing the alternatives that we have in this world, so that these trials would be absolutely non-existent and unnecessary. But unfortunately, we have a Milosevic. We have Tedesco. We had all kinds of people who committed all these inhuman deeds that make these international trials necessary. And I have to come back to education. Raleigh made a very good statement yesterday, and I thought it was a very profound statement. He compared what had happened in the Holocaust, some of the activities, to what happened in Iraq in that prison. And I must tell you that I would find it absolutely terrifying if any of those soldiers could have been, and they couldn't have been, my former students. And this is the absolute mission of every teacher and of every parent. In our generation, of those of us who are adults, to make sure that those beneath us, the generation following us, cannot absolutely have the potential for doing this kind of dehumanizing acts that happened in the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, as happened to the POWs in Mauthausen, it happened in Auschwitz, in Treblinka, or in the labor camps. It is absolutely a prerogative. It's an imperative of this generation to bring it to a halt. because otherwise we do not deserve the title of being a human being. And it's something that I keep repeating and repeating. The definition of a human being is simply stated in these two words: being human.
How'd you like to be the head of our education department up here? This is true. I have there was a quote that you used it in an article, and there's a Jewish phrase. It's called working towards, and I'm going to have to just spell it because I'll brutalize it.
Tikkun olam.
Yes.
Yeah. Tikkun olam is a Hebrew word meaning working towards the betterment of the world, to save the world. And it is not just a phrase, it is a commandment that every person should make as his or her mission by his or her sojourn in this world to make a difference for the betterment of the world. And I feel that every one of us, regardless what profession we are in, regardless what kind of a mission we design for ourselves, has a legacy to leave. And that legacy indeed is to improve this world, so we leave it better than what we encountered when we came here.
When you came back to the United States in 1946, and you obviously had already done educating, teaching that first Holocaust course in the United States must have been difficult.
Well, I'll tell you how it came about. I was on the faculty, English faculty at the University of Miami, and I was teaching world literature. And as a Jewish member of the faculty, I was an advisor to a Jewish student home, which is called the Hillel House. It's sort of a non-fraternity fraternity. It was just like a Newman house for the Catholic students. And I was on the board of the Hillel House, and the director of Hillel House had asked me to sort of not teach, but present a course on the Holocaust. He had what he called an open university. And I said, no, I cannot do it. And he prevailed upon me to do it once or twice, and it was on Thursday night. And on Friday morning, I would come back to the classrooms, and I would feel that I just couldn't perform. I was psychosomatically ill internally. So I said, no, Stanley, I cannot do it. And at one time, he brought to the Hillel House Elie Wiesel. It was in 1969. Elie Wiesel had just written the book Night. Actually, it was the English translation, because none of the publishers in America would accept the book for publication. So Elie had to go to Argentina, where it was published in Yiddish. He wrote it in French, because after liberation he found himself in Paris, and he went to the Sorbonne, and he wrote, he really had very good facility with the French language, and he wrote it in French. So it was translated into Yiddish, and it was actually printed in Argentina. And then they finally accepted it for publication here in '68, and in '69 Elie went to different venues, like organizations and universities, and tried to promote his book. And I was asked by the Hillel director to give a reception for Elie Wiesel in my home, which I did. And I walked over to him, and I said to him, tell me, actually I went over to his wife Marian, and I said to Marian, tell me, how can he do it? Doesn't he get any nightmares? And she says, why don't you ask him? And I did. And I said, Ellie, how can you do that? I find it impossible. And as I told Raleigh, he looked straight into my eyes and he put his two hands on my shoulders and he says, Helen, if you and I, who are witnesses and have the credibility, don't do it, we will have to leave it to the fantasy and the imagination for other people. And the language had not been invented yet that could describe it. And at that time, one other faculty member, a Jewish faculty member, said to me, I am going to plant the book Night on the desk of our department chairman, who was a former Methodist minister, Dr. John McCollum, and ask him if he would read it and if he would find himself amenable to having you offer a course on the literature of the Holocaust. And there was no literature of the Holocaust really at that time. And I had to write a syllabus. And I had to really work towards constructing a bona fide course. And when I wrote the proposal to the college council to consider it, one of the professor approached me and he says, what next, Helen? What next? Who do you think would want to take a course on the literature of the Holocaust? Well, what happened was that the chairman had enough confidence in me and he says, well, I'll let you teach us an experimental course, but you must have a minimum of 15 students. Fortunately, I had a following, and the first registration was 32 students, and from then on I had waiting lists. I closed the course at 50 to 55 students, and I had a waiting list constantly, every single semester. So this is how it came about. And then I developed other courses. I taught a course on men and God after Auschwitz. Then I requested that I be allowed to teach a course on the roots of anti-Semitism as a prerequisite to the course on the literature of the Holocaust, because many of my students had the old concept in their minds about anti-Semitism as something that the Jews deserve because of the deicide. So I had to give them the history of it. And it was also a very popular course. So that's the story.
And you also were involved in assisting the creation of the educational programming at the Holocaust Museum in Washington?
Very much so.
Yep.
I have with me a letter that I found. I told Raleigh about that. I found a letter, and I have it in my purse, from Elie Wiesel, dated 1980. Actually, it was President Jimmy Carter who created a commission in between 79 and 80, and it was called the United States Holocaust Memorial Council. And the idea for the council was to eventually build a museum. And the museum was going to serve educational purposes. So Elie Wiesel wrote me a letter asking me to be his advisor, 1980. And then I served, so I was his education advisor. In 1986, I was appointed to the Museum Content Committee, where we discussed what kind of a content will we have in the museum. And we developed a task force, an acquisition task force, and an archival task force. And then we decided to become an educational agency in such a way that we would be the central agency for Holocaust education. And I was appointed chair of the Holocaust education, and we already developed the educational track, which the museum is following now. We developed the guide for teachers, which the museum is using now. And we really started, I started the educational track for the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C.
Congratulations. Is there a hero in your mind's eye? And Helen Fagin says, that person is that exemplar.
I would say that to me the heroes of the Holocaust are both Jewish and non-Jewish. The Jewish heroes of the Holocaust are indeed those who were involved both in the spiritual and the physical resistance. These are my heroes. The fighters of the Warsaw Ghetto are certainly the heroes. The people who wrote the diaries, the Ringenblums, the Kovners, the people who wrote the diaries, and for example, notes from the Warsaw Ghetto by Ringenblum were buried in milk cans in the Warsaw Ghetto. And then they were dug out and they were put in the cornerstone of the museum in Washington. The people who wrote during the event, these are the heroes, because they really endangered their lives. I would say Raoul Wallenberg is my hero. I would say Vernon Fry is my hero. He is the one who saved the Marc Chagall and Einstein and Freud and Barbara Tuchman. I mean, giant intellects. He saved them, although he was reprimanded by the government later on and relieved of his post in the south of France. My hero is the ambassador, the Japanese ambassador in Kovno, who gave false papers to a number of Jews who later found themselves in Shanghai. These are the heroes of the Holocaust. These are the individuals who show their character. Those people who hid Jews, those whom we called righteous Gentiles. You know, in Jerusalem, next to the memorial Yad Vashem is an alley, we call it the Righteous Gentiles alley, where we have trees planted for every righteous Gentile who helped Jews to survive. These are my heroes. My survival is not a heroic survival. My survival is a combination of luck and resilience, and maybe a little bit of imagination. What I am involved in is giving meaning to my survival. Meaning to the survival of those who could have been victims and not survived. So it is an obligation and a responsibility that those of us who survive and who take on that mission seriously, to give a meaning not only to our survival, but to the deaths of those others who could not survive.
Wow. Thank you.
You're quite welcome.
To come to the Jackson Center.
My privilege.
Yeah. I think it's, you guys having lunch?
Yeah, we're going to have lunch upstairs in the Bar Association room.
Helen, I'll get this.
Sandwiches.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. I don't know why in Polish we call it a frog.
This?
Yes. Yeah, żabka we call it.